Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. If you have not already subscribed to my channel, please do subscribe to my channel. Today's topic is conditional and iterative macro statements. And this is part 4 of SAS Macro Series. Now let us quickly discuss what are the topics we are going to cover. I'm going to cover percent if, percent then, in which we will be talking about syntax and examples, and also what percent if, percent then can do, and when we should not use percent if, percent then. And then we will go into percent do group. Here also we will look into syntax, example, and when it is useful. And also we will be discussing about percent do group in the context of using it in the open code. Then we will talk about iterative percent do loop. Again here I will get into the syntax and also understanding implicit percent eval. And then we will be moving on to percent do percent while and percent do percent until. And here also we will discuss into syntax and examples and also about how they are different. And also one example we will be discussing wherein I will be explaining how to write the code more efficiently, that is how we can write our percent if then statements in a better way so that we avoid a redundant code. Now let us quickly look into simple percent if, percent then. Percent if, percent then should always need to be embedded in a macro, means we can't run this code out of the macro, so always it should be in the macro. And every percent if, percent then should have a semicolon at the end. And also here another important point to remember is, here we are saying percent if ampersand macvar equal to test percent then percent put this is correct input. So what we are doing is, depending upon this value, we are putting a text into the log. Here when we pass macvar equal to test, this is what we are going to see in the log. If you see this percent if, percent then, it is very similar to if then what we use in a data step. One major difference in here is, here percent if we are using on a macro variable or we are using a text. It is very important to know that percent if, percent then we are not using on variables. We are either using on macro variables or text. I will go into detail on this topic in the future slides. Now let us look into percent if, percent then and percent else. Now here we have else and everything else is similar. We have our percent if then and then we have semicolon. After that we can have percent else and semicolon. This is very similar to what we see in our data step, but in data step we have else if and here we don't have any else if. And here percent else, as I said, it should end with semicolon. And when we pass our macro variable value, if the condition matches, then this particular statement is put in the log, else this statement is put in the log. Here we are passing the value test, so it's going to put this statement in the log, and that is what I have pasted in here. Now let us go a little bit deeper and understand the execution pattern and what happens. To understand how a macro is executed, it is always important to have options M logic. It tells about how your macro is executed, and also when you have percent if then, it also tells what's happening in your percent if then else statement. When we have options M logic and we are executing our macro with the value of macvar equal to test, then what happens is it tells us that the execution is started and the parameter we have passed is test and the condition here is true. This third line, if you look little bit deeper, it tells about what has happened in the execution. That is why we see this particular statement in the log. For the same macro, when we are passing new test, as this new test is not equal to test, this will become false and our else statement will get executed. Now let us also try to understand what else we can do with the help of percent if percent then statement. Percent if percent then statement, apart from creating the text, is also useful to create macro variables conditionally. Here we have a macro in which we have our percent if percent then statements, and in here if you see after percent then we have our percent let statement, wherein when the condition matches we are saying we want to create a new macro variable in which I am saying in here its name is new macvar and I am giving a value to it. So just not creating the text, but we can also create new macro variables conditionally with the help of percent if percent then statement. And when we pass macvar equal to class, this class becomes class, and then the value of macvar we can see as SAS help dot class. Sorry, the value of new macvar as SAS help dot class. And apart from creating macro variables, we can do many other things, but let's also get little bit deeper. After conditionally creating macro variables, like in here, we can also use them in the macro itself. For example, here we are creating a new macro variable by using percent if percent then and using a percent let statement, and the new macro variable which we have created we have used in here, and when we execute this by giving a class value, what happens is class becomes class, and then new macro variable new macvar is created which we are using in here, and it has the value of sashelp.class and it proc prints sashelp.class. Not only creating macro variables conditionally, we can also conditionally execute macros with the help of percent if percent then. Here we have macro test and macro test one. They are just little different. We have different dataset names for both our proc print and proc means for macro test and macro test one. But we can conditionally execute this macro or this macro by using our percent if percent then statement in here. In here I have macro, a new macro which I am creating, and here I have percent if ampersand macvar equal to hello percent then percent test, which means when macvar, if I pass the value of hello, it will execute this macro. If we pass the value of macvar which is not equal to hello, it is going to execute test1 macro. If we see the two executions of percent both underscore test macros, what we have done is we have passed the value of macvar equal to hello, and this helped us to execute percent test, that is we were able to execute test macro, or when we have passed the value of hello 1, that is the condition has not matched here, it has executed test1 macro. Now let us talk about percent do groups. Again, this is percent do groups, and this is not about a loop or anything of that sort. Here we are talking more about groups. The groups we use generally, we want to address lot of SAS statements with semicolons or anything which has semicolons. Now let us try to understand more on this with the help of a macro in here. Here I have percent macro and I am naming it as do test, and I have one parameter dsn equal to. In here I am saying percent if ampersand dsn equal to SAS help dot class percent then percent do proc print data equal to ampersand dsn semicolon run semicolon percent end, and then I'm ending my macro with percent met. Here let's focus on our percent do. What if I don't have this percent do and end? As you all know, every do should have an end, and in this case we have percent do and we have percent end. And we have this percent do to handle these two semicolons, that is one after this proc print statement, another after run statement. As I have said earlier, whenever we have just percent then and percent if, it should end with a semicolon. And here we have two semicolon. Percent then cannot handle two semicolons. What I'm saying is not 100% true. There are ways to handle it by using quoting functions, but that's an advanced topic and we are not going into it right now. We will be discussing more on when I'm going to discuss about macro functions. But percent if percent then ends after one semicolon. We can't embed multiple SAS statements in here. So to handle these multiple SAS statements with semicolon, we use do groups. So percent do is mainly to accommodate extra semicolons. Now let us look into the execution. Here we have percent do test, and here we also have a small mistake. This is supposed to be dsn equal to SAS help.class, and I'm sorry for the inconvenience. And once we pass the value of SAS help.class for dsn, here this becomes SAS help.class equal to SAS help.class, and these statements will be generated and proc print will run. And we can also add percent else to this also. But unlike percent if, percent then, here we also have percent else, and we also need to do a percent do and percent end. And this macro is pretty similar to what I have shown in you earlier. Only difference is we have a percent else macro statement also in here, wherein we have percent l, percent do, and we also are adding a SAS statements in here. Of course, these SAS statements are nothing more than text to your macro statements. And this is proc means data equal to ampersand dsn semicolon run semicolon, and it ends with and we have percent. Now let's also try to execute this macro. Here I'm executing the macro, and in here I'm giving dsn equal to SAS help.cars. The if condition does not match because SAS help.cars is not equal to SAS help.class. So the percent else condition comes into picture, and proc means of SAS help.cars runs, and the results you can see in here. So the bottom line, percent do group is very similar to percent if percent then, the only difference being the accommodation of more statements which have semicolons. Especially we need this whenever we have lot of SAS statements which have semicolons embedded within them. Now let us try to understand one another important aspect of percent do group. The advantages of percent do group is we can run percent do groups in open code also, and this started from SAS 9.4 M5. As you have seen earlier, whenever we wanted to run any of percent if, percent then, percent do, all I was showing you to embed them in a macro and then run them. But starting from SAS 9.4 M5, for do groups, we do not have to have the whole thing embed in a macro. For example, I'm showing the same thing what I have shown you before, but this is not embedded in a macro. There is no percent macro name, there is no percent mend, and I can just select this part and I can run, and then it executes and gives us the result we want. So here I have percent let dsn1 equal to SAS help.class, as it is SAS help.class equal to SAS help.class, and then whenever I run this code, it proc prints the result for me. Percent do group can also be used to conditionally execute macro in open code. Here we have percent if, percent then, and percent do, and then we are executing a macro whenever this condition matches. and finally we have our percent %n for this percent %do group. And here I want to tell couple of things. Earlier, whenever we want to use percent if percent then, we have to embed them in the macro, but we are trying to use percent if percent then percent %do, so we can execute macro conditionally in open code. Another important thing is I have not put any semicolon after the execution, that is after percent test. Macro execution does not need a semicolon, and if you don't put a semicolon, it is fine. So here I have defined my percent let dsn1 equal to SAS help.class, and then this condition is matched in here, so this executes your macro. So percent %do group helps us also to make the code little bit simpler by not embedding them completely in macro whenever we want to do that. Now let us also look into something else which is important, that is how to think anything other than SAS macro statements as text and how it is useful. Now I want to illustrate this with an example here. In here I have a macro and I am calling this macro as simplify this, and my parameter is macvar equal to. Here I am having percent if percent then percent %do. When this condition matches, I want to have data sales set sashelp.pid sale 12, and I want to keep some variables followed by run statement and then end. For this percent then do this end. If the condition does not match, that means whenever you pass a value which is not hello, then it should do this, that is percent else percent %do data sales set sashelp.pid sale and keep some variables run, and then percent end and percent %ment. So if you see here, depending on the condition, we are creating a data set in here or we are creating a data set in here. And the important point I wanted to understand in here is not to think in the terms of data step or data or anything else, but in the terms of text. Why I am saying this? If you see here, we have written 4 lines of code and we have 4 lines of code in here. Or for this macro, this is nothing more than text. So 4 lines of text, 4 lines of text. We have written 8 lines of text. But if we look closely, data sales is common in both the conditions and run is same for both the condition. So we can improve this macro by not writing this data sales and run multiple times. To understand this, what I have done is I have pasted the same macro what I have shown you earlier on the top and a modified macro in here. So what simply we can do is we can take the data sales out of these percent if then statements and keep on the top, and also what we can do is we can keep run also on the bottom. If you see here, I have moved data sales from here to top and run from here to bottom. So whenever the code gets executed, for example, whenever I pass the value of hello here, it becomes hello equal to hello, and it generates these 2 lines of text. And what happens is data sales is there on the top and run is there on the bottom, so it becomes data sales set SAS help.pid sale and the keep statement with few variables and then run. And also if we are passing a value which is not equivalent to hello, what will happen is again it will generate these 2 lines of statements, and then we have data sales on the top, these two statements followed by the run. So it finally forms data sales set sas.pid sale and keep with few variables in here run. Bottom line, what we have to understand is what finally all these statements will become. Means what are the text we want to generate, and what is the text before and what is the text afterwards, and after executing what happens. This is very important point to understand and assimilate. We always need to think in the terms of writing less redundant and efficient code. Now let us look into another aspect wherein the new programmers often do mistakes on. That is, they will try to use percent if percent then statement on SAS data step variables. For example, here I have a macro, and this macro I am calling it as ABCD, and then I have data cars set SAS help.cars percent if type equal to SUV percent then new equal to 10. So the new programmers often think that this type equal to SUV should be understood by this percent if statement, but that does not happen. What actually happens here is when we execute this code, this percent if percent then statement get executed first. So in this percent if type equal to SUV percent then new equal to 10 gets executed. So the type will be treated as a text. This text is not equal to this text, then this percent then doesn't execute. So it is very important to understand that part. And then finally what happens is these data cars set sas.cars run, these statements gets created and they get executed with the help of SAS compiler, and then data cars will be created. Now let us try to understand this even more better by looking into the similar macro, but here I have my percent if statement changed. Here I am saying percent if quotes SUV equal to quotes SUV percent then new equal to 10. And then what happens in this case when we execute this macro, this percent if statement runs first. As I've said to you very many times, this percent symbol is known as macro triggers and it runs first. As SUV equal to SUV, this percent then will generate this new equal to 10, and then what happens is then data car set sashelp.cars new equal to 10 run, these statements are created and SAS compiler understands them and it executes the code and a new variable is created. The point here I am trying to emphasize is percent if percent then statements are meant for comparison of text or for the comparison of macro variables or comparison of text with the macro variables. Of course, the macro variable value itself is nothing more than a text. So be very careful in this particular point. Now we are left with percent do loops, wherein I would like to talk about iterative percent do loop, percent do percent until, percent do percent while. But before going into those details, it is again important to understand what macro variables are and little bit more about percent eval also we need to know. Now I can define my macro variable by percent let statement as my mac var equal to 1 plus 2, and if I want to see this my mac var value I can use a percent put statement and I can reference my macro variable by using ampersand my mac var, and the result here we can see is 1 plus 2. So here this indicates that everything we mention in here is text, so we see the result also as a text and nothing happens even though we have a plus operator in here. But if we want the calculations to be done, we need to use something like percent eval. Percent eval is a macro function, more on the macro functions when we will be talking exclusively on macro function, and then we can do 1 plus 2. And when we look or when we try to see the value of my mac var 1, we can see the result as 3. So some calculations to be done, especially here addition, we need to use percent eval. Now I would also explain why I have told or why I have discussed this slide in a bit. But first let's look into percent do loop. Percent do loop is also very similar to what we have seen in a regular simple do loop. Iterative percent do loop. This is very similar to what we have seen or what we see in our data step do loop. It starts with percent do I equal to 1% to 5. Whenever we don't give by, it means we want it to be increment by 1, and we can have any statements in here. In our case, we are trying to find or we are trying to put this value to log, that is the value of I, and percent end. So percent do percent end is same, and instead of 2 we have percent 2. And important thing to understand in here is we are creating macro variable in here as opposed to variable when we use simple do loops. And also in percent do loops, we can execute whatever the code we have or whatever text we have this many times. But coming to the percent do loop in here, let's try to understand it better. When our percent do loop starts, the I value will be 1, and here you can see the value of I is 1, and then it increments by 1, it becomes 2, and then increments by 1, it becomes 3, then increments by 1 more 4, and it increments 1 more 5. It tries to increment one more time, but as the endpoint is already reached, it doesn't loop through anymore. And also remember, even though I have not shown you here, you can have a code here and can execute it multiple times. I have shown this example in very first macro class, wherein I have showed that how we can use proc append and run it 100 times. And I will give the link for the same in the description below. You can have a look into that also. Now that we have looked into percent do loop, now it is a good time to understand what really happens. As I told to you, macro variable is text, but if you see, I'm again saying that it is incrementing by 1. How is that happening? This is what is known as implicit eval or implied eval. Let's call it as implicit eval. So what actually happens when we create this macro and compile this macro, and when we execute this macro, what really happening is this. Our percent eval is running behind the scene, and what it does is it creates the value of 1 in the first step or in the first iteration, and then in the second iteration it adds one more, but behind the scene percent eval is running something like this, wherein after it becomes 2 it adds one more, percent eval runs behind the scenes. So the important point to understand in here is an implicit percent eval runs whenever we do percent do loops like this. And more on this implicit percent evals when we talk about functions in the next class. Now let us look into percent do, percent while and percent do, percent until, but I would like to start with percent do, percent while. And here for both percent do, percent while, we do not have a starting point and ending point like regular iterative do loop where you give a starting point and an ending point or a start or an end. But they have condition mention after percent do, percent while. In until also it is the same. You say percent do, percent until, and you have condition mention in the parenthesis here. Now to understand percent do, percent while, let's look into this macro in here. In this macro, I am defining percent let I equal to 1, which means I am creating macro variable whose value is 1. Now I am saying percent do, percent while, and I am saying in here in the parenthesis the condition is ampersand I le5, means I want to loop while the condition is true when my ampersand I is less than equal to 5. Means when I am entering into the loop, if the condition is less than equal to 5, it should loop. And in here, as you can see in percent do while, when we initially start to go into the loop, the value of 1 is less than equal to 5, and as this condition is true, it goes into the loop. And we also have a percent put statement which puts the value into the log. And then we have percent let I equal to percent eval ampersand I plus 1. So percent put will put the value of 1, and we are adding 1 to this ampersand I, and it becomes 2, and our I will have the now value of 2. And it again goes and checks in the condition here 2 is still less than equal to 5, and it puts the ampersand I value, and again it adds plus 1 and it becomes 3, and it again loops through, and again it puts the value in the log. We are going to add 1 to this ampersand I, it becomes 4, and then 4 is still less than equal to 5, and then we put the value in the log, and then percent eval, again here we are adding one more. Now it becomes 6, and then once it is 6 it tries to loop again. As it checks in here that ampersand I is no longer less than equal to 5, it comes out of the loop and it does not put or it does not do anything. So the values of this you can see in here. So percent do while is always about having a condition in here, and then you loop through it, and once the condition is met, the loop is ended with the percent end, and you can see the values of your I in here, and I have pasted this from the log. So to sum it up, percent do while, the condition will be there and it executes while the condition is true and stops when the condition is false. Here the condition which I have given is more about dealing with numbers. This condition could be anything. And one important thing about percent do while is if you give a condition which is always true, it will loop forever, and you have to be very careful about that and what condition you are going to give, and you have to see that the condition is not always true so that it can come out of the loop. And again, percent do while, what it does is before going into the loop itself, it checks the value on the top. What does that mean? Here I have percent let I equal to 1. Before going into the loop, it checks the value in here, then only it goes into the loop. Now that we have looked into percent do while in a detailed way, now let's try to look in for percent do, percent until. Everything in here is same except that here we have percent do, percent until, Here I am saying ampersand I greater than 5. Percent do percent until execute till the condition becomes true. Means here the value is 1 till it reaches greater than 5. It loops through again and again and again and again until it becomes greater than 5, and once it becomes greater than 5 it comes out of the loop. So couple of things here. If we are giving a condition in percent do percent until which will never become true, it will loop forever. And again, in the case of percent do until, here even though we have defined percent let I equal to 1, it does not check on the top. It will loop at least once. This is something very different than what we have in percent do percent while. Say if the I is 6, it will still loop once and then only it will come out. Whereas in the case of percent do while, it checks on the top. If the condition is not true, it will no longer go in the loop. These are some differences between percent do while and percent do until. And here in the percent do until, the condition may not be related to numbers, it could be again anything. Now that we have covered a lot of concepts on percent if, percent then, percent if, percent then, percent do loop, and percent do while, and percent do until, I want to tell that now we have just learned fundamentals and how we can use these concepts. I will be capturing more of those in the future sessions. And with this, I want to conclude this topic. And that's all for this topic. If you have liked this topic, please give it a thumbs up, share, and subscribe. Thank you.